The scream, when it finally tore from Lily's small chest, was a sound of such profound, unadulterated anguish that it seemed to rip the serene afternoon air of Serene Meadows to shreds. Evelyn Hayes, her mother, felt it like a physical blow, a shard of ice, embedding itself in her heart even before she saw the cause. Lily stood, pointing her body rigid, her face a mask of pure horror at the empty space in their backyard, where Clover's meticulously secured hutch and run should have held her beloved therapy rabbit. Clover was gone. A frantic, desperate search ensued Evie's professional calm, battling the rising tide of maternal panic. Lily, her 8-year-old autistic world already a place of carefully navigated sensitivities, was dissolving into a meltdown, her keening cries echoing the frantic thumping of Evie's own heart. The gate to the run was unlatched, but not broken. No signs of digging. No telltale tufts of soft gray fur caught on the fence. This wasn't an escape. This felt deliberate. A cold dread, sharp and sickening, began to uncoil in Evie's stomach. Their neighbor, Mrs. Millicent Thornwood, HOA president, and self-appointed guardian of Serene Meadows' aesthetic purity, had made her disdain for Clover abundantly repeatedly clear. A rodent she'd sniffed on more than one occasion, her eyes flicking dismissively towards Clover's enclosure. Hardly appropriate for a neighborhood of this caliber, and therapy animal for what precisely children these days are coddled. Ben, Evie's husband, had installed a new security camera system only weeks ago after a series of petty HOA notices from Mrs. Thornwood about the unapproved shade of their welcome mat and the excessive exuberance of Lily's wind chimes. Now, with trembling fingers, Evie pulled up the footage on her tablet, Lily's sobs a relentless counterpoint to the clicking keys. The images that flickered onto the screen stole the breath from her lungs, replacing it with a roiling miasma of disbelief and a rage so potent it was almost physically painful. There was Millicent Thornwood, her movements furtive but unmistakable, approaching Clover's hutch. She cooed a grotesque parody of affection, luring the trusting rabbit with a piece of carrot. Then, with a swift, practiced motion, she unlatched the hutch, scooped up the placid Flemish giant, and disappeared from that camera's view, heading towards her own adjoining property. Evie fast-forwarded to Millicent's own backyard camera feed, one Ben had cleverly, and with a vague unease, Evie now understood angled to capture a sliver of the Thornwood property due to its proximity to their fence line. The quality was grainier, partially obscured by a large rosebush Millicent was inordinately proud of. But the scene it revealed, even in its dappled, horrifying clarity, was unambiguous. Millicent, holding Clover, approached a large, fenced dog run at the far end of her yard. Inside, a massive, brindled mastiff, Brutus, a dog, whose aggressive barking was a constant neighborhood menace, began to pace its heavy tail, thudding in anticipation. Millicent spoke to the dog, her words inaudible, but her actions sickeningly clear. She opened the gate to Brutus's run. And then, Evie couldn't breathe. She slammed the tablet shut, a strangled cry escaping her lips. The image, the implication burned into her retinas, seared into her soul. She had seen enough. More than enough. Lily, sensing the shift in her mother's demeanor, her own distress, momentarily overridden by a child's acute sensitivity to adult horror, looked up her tear-streaked face, questioning. "Mama, where's Clover? Did the camera see him? How did you tell your autistic daughter a child, for whom that gentle lop-eared rabbit was not just a pet, but an emotional lifeline, a furry, steadfast anchor in the often overwhelming sea of her sensory world, that he had been stolen?" And then Evie's mind recoiled from forming the words. The professional in her, Dr. Evelyn Hayes, director of the National Animal Rights Protection Task Force, a woman who had waded through the darkest depths of human cruelty, towards animals, who had built airtight cases against abusers, who understood the cold, hard letter of the law, was screaming for action, for evidence preservation, for the full weight of justice to be brought down. But the mother in her was simply breaking. The horror of what she had just witnessed, the sheer calculated malice of it, was a fresh kind of hell, one that targeted not just an innocent animal, but the fragile, precious heart of her child. Millicent Thornwood, in her arrogant quest for a rodent-free, aesthetically uniform Serene Meadows, had just committed an act of unimaginable cruelty. She had fed Lily's soul to her dog, and she had no idea that the woman whose world she had just shattered was uniquely terrifyingly equipped to make her pay for every single shred of it. The move to Serene Meadows 18 months ago had been a carefully considered decision, a pursuit of peace, and the promise of an excellent specialized school program for Lily. Evie's work as director of the NARPTF was demanding, often taking her to the grim front lines of animal abuse cases across the country. She'd seen unspeakable things face down dangerous individuals, navigated complex legal battles. Their small, ivy-covered house, in what was marketed as a tranquil, family-friendly enclave, was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where the ugliness of her professional world could not penetrate. Lily, diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at age 4, found solace in a unique connection with animals. After extensive consultation with Lily's therapists, Clover, a gentle, placid Flemish giant with fur like spun silk and eyes like melted chocolate, had come into their lives. He wasn't just a pet. He was a registered therapy animal, his calm, grounding presence a remarkable balm for Lily's anxieties. He was her confidant, her steadfast companion, the soft, warm weight of him in her lap, a more effective regulator of her sensory overloads than any medication. She would spend hours in their secure backyard Clover, hopping contentedly in his spacious run, Lily reading to him, her voice soft and melodic, a world away from the often jarring cacophony of human interaction. The Serene Meadows Homeowners Association and its formidable president, Mrs. Millicent Thornwood, had from the outset presented a subtle undercurrent of friction. Millicent, a woman whose silver hair was sculpted into a helmet of unyielding rigidity, patrolled the neighborhood like a minor despot, her eyes missing no perceived infraction. Her pronouncements on everything from the approved species of lawn grass to the maximum allowable height of children's swing sets were legendary. The first direct confrontation had come 3 months after they moved in. Millicent had appeared at their door, clipboard in hand, her expression one of pained duty. Dr. Hayes, she'd begun, her voice devoid of any neighborly warmth. "I'm afraid there's been a complaint regarding the rabbit hutch in your backyard." Evie, ever polite but firm, had explained Clover's status as a registered therapy animal essential for Lily's well-being. She'd pointed out that the hutch and run were discreet, well-maintained, and exceeded all local animal welfare guidelines. Millicent had sniffed a sound of profound disapproval. "Therapy animal, you say? For what precisely nerves?" "In my day, children were taught resilience, not catered to with livestock. Frankly, Dr. Hayes, a large rodent enclosure is hardly in keeping with the aesthetic standards of Serene Meadows. It attracts flies and other vermin." Her gaze had flicked meaningfully towards the woods bordering their properties. "We have a reputation to maintain, property values to consider." Evie had felt a familiar spark of anger, but had kept her tone measured. "Clover is not livestock, Mrs. Thornwood. He is a vital part of my daughter's support system, and his enclosure is kept impeccably clean. I assure you, he poses no threat to property values or public health." "We shall see," Millicent had replied, making a small, decisive tick on her clipboard. "I will be monitoring the situation. Serene Meadows has very strict covenants regarding outbuildings and the keeping of non-domesticated animals." That had been the inciting incident, the first clear indication of Millicent's specific animosity towards Clover, and by extension towards Lily's needs, which she clearly viewed as an inconvenient deviation from her perfectly ordered world. Several more petty complaints had followed, about Lily's laughter being too shrill during backyard play, about a string of solar-powered fairy lights Evie had hung around Clover's run being distracting. Each one had been met with Evie's polite but unyielding explanations, and each one had seemed to harden Millicent's resentment. Now, kneeling on her kitchen floor, the horrifying images from the security footage seared into her brain, Evie felt that resentment had metastasized into something monstrous. Ben found her there, a low, guttural sob tearing from her chest, as Lily, her small body racked with inconsolable grief, clung to her. He took one look at Evie's face, then at the discarded tablet, and his own blood ran cold. "Evie, what is it? What's happened?" Through a haze of tears and rising fury, she choked out the words, the images, the sheer unthinkable barbarity of what their neighbor had done. Ben, a software engineer whose gentle nature was the perfect counterpoint to Evie's intensity, listened, his face draining of all color, his hands clenching into fists. That monster, He whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief and rage. He pulled Evie and Lily into a fierce embrace. Okay, Evie. Okay. Tell me what we do. Tell me how we make her pay. The professional in Evie, momentarily submerged by the tidal wave of maternal grief, began to resurface, cold and sharp. First, she said, her voice trembling, but resolute, we preserve every second of that footage. Multiple copies, cloud storage, hard drives. Then we call the police and animal control. We document everything. Lily's distress, the empty hutch, everything. Her mind was already cataloging the charges felony animal cruelty, especially given Clover's status as a therapy animal and the premeditated malicious nature of the act, theft of property, and crucially, the infliction of severe emotional distress and psychological abuse of a minor. And then Ben asked, his eyes blazing with a protective fury that mirrored her own. And then Evie said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm, Millicent Thornwood is going to learn what happens when you prey on the vulnerable. She's going to learn about the full extent of the laws designed to protect animals and children. She has no idea who she just messed with. The initial call to 911 was a lesson in frustration. The dispatcher, while polite, seemed to categorize it as a lost pet or a dog attack, struggling to grasp the premeditated cruelty, the therapy animal aspect, the deliberate theft. Evie, trying to maintain her composure for Lily's sake, had to repeat the horrifying details several times before a patrol car was dispatched. Officer Crumans arrived, a young, fresh-faced policeman who looked more like he should be directing school traffic than investigating a crime of such calculated malice. He listened with a vaguely sympathetic but clearly bewildered expression as Evie, her voice tight with suppressed emotion, recounted what she had seen on the security footage. So, ma'am, he began, flipping open his notepad. You're saying your neighbor, Mrs. Thornwood, took your daughter's rabbit and fed it to her dog. He looked frankly incredulous, as if she were describing a scene from a particularly lurid horror film. That is precisely what I am saying, Officer Evie stated, her patience wearing thin. And I have it on video. She queued up the footage on her tablet, shielding the most graphic final moments from Lily, who was now huddled in Ben's arms, her small body still shaking with sobs. Officer Crumans watched his initial skepticism slowly morphing into a horrified disbelief. The color drained from his face. Sweet Mary, he muttered, recoiling slightly from the screen. Okay. That's bad. That's really bad. He then approached Mrs. Thornwood's house. Millicent answered the door, the picture of affronted innocence, her silver hair immaculate, a pastel cashmere cardigan draped artfully over her shoulders. Brutus the Mastiff barked aggressively from somewhere inside the house. Officer Crumans, she said, her voice laced with a practiced air of weary patience. To what do I owe this intrusion? I was just about to have my afternoon tea. Crumans, clearly uncomfortable, relayed Evie's accusation. Millicent's reaction was a masterpiece of feigned outrage and denial. A rabbit, my Brutus. Preposterous. Brutus is a champion show dog, a gentle giant. If Mrs. Hayes has lost her pet, perhaps she should look to her own inadequate enclosure. My property is securely fenced, and frankly, officer, I find these accusations deeply offensive. This is clearly a malicious attempt by an unstable neighbor to harass me. She even managed to produce a tear, dabbing at her eye with a lace-trimmed handkerchief. That poor child of hers. One does worry about the environment she's being raised in. Crumans returned to Evie, looking even more flustered. She denies everything, ma'am. Says her dog wouldn't hurt a fly. Says you're harassing her. And the video, officer, Evie demanded, her voice dangerously low. Does she deny the video? She said it must be doctored, or that it doesn't show what you claim it shows. That the rabbit must have escaped and her dog found it. An unfortunate accident. An accident that she facilitated by stealing my daughter's registered therapy animal and delivering it to her dog's jaws. Evie's control was slipping. Officer Crumans, this woman has committed multiple felonies. I expect her to be arrested. I expect her dog to be impounded as evidence, or at least assessed for aggressive tendencies by animal control. I expect a thorough investigation. Crumans sighed. Ma'am, I understand you're distraught. And that video, it's disturbing, but without a body, without clear, undeniable footage of the actual act of feeding, it's her word against yours on some of the specifics. And she's a prominent citizen HOA president. I'll have to file a report, of course. Animal control will be notified. but an immediate arrest. I'll need to consult with my sergeant with the DA's office. He sounded like he was already preparing to categorize this as a messy, he-said-she-said neighbor dispute, albeit one with a particularly gruesome alleged element. Evie felt a cold fury, but also a grim sense of inevitability. This was often how it started. The minimization, the disbelief, the reluctance to confront powerful or well-connected individuals, especially when the victim was just an animal. But Clover wasn't just an animal, and Evie Hayes wasn't just a distraught pet owner. Animal Control Officer Ramirez, a tired-looking woman with compassionate eyes, arrived later that afternoon. She listened carefully, reviewed the footage with a grim expression, and documented the scene at Clover's empty hutch. She explained that without clear evidence of Clover's remains or a confession from Mrs. Thornwood, and given Brutus was on Thornwood's property, impounding the dog immediately would be difficult unless there was a prior history of aggression or an immediate public safety threat. She did, however, issue Mrs. Thornwood a stern warning about leash laws and ensuring Brutus was securely contained, and made notes about the potential for a dangerous dog investigation. The next day, Millicent Thornwood, clearly emboldened by the lack of immediate arrest, escalated her offensive. An official-looking letter arrived from a prestigious downtown law firm, now on retainer for Mrs. Thornwood, personally, not just the HOA. It was a cease and desist order accusing Evelyn and Ben Hayes of defamation harassment and the malicious fabrication of evidence with intent to cause distress and reputational harm to Mrs. Thornwood. It threatened a multi-million-dollar lawsuit if they did not immediately retract all statements to the police and Animal Control, issue a public apology, and surrender all copies of the allegedly defamatory video footage. "She's trying to bury us in legal fees before we even get started," Ben said, his face pale as he read the letter. "This is insane. She's the one who did that, and now she's threatening us." "It's a slap suit tactic," Evie said grimly, though her mind was already dissecting the legal posturing. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation, designed to intimidate and silence critics by overwhelming them with legal costs. It's a bully's favored weapon when they have deep pockets and no conscience. She knows we have the video. She's trying to scare us into backing down." Then came the HOA. An emergency board meeting was convened, one to which Evie and Ben were pointedly not invited. The minutes later, leaked to Evie by a horrified junior board member who subsequently resigned, detailed how Mrs. Thornwood, with the staunch support of her two vice presidents, managed to pass a resolution. It stated that due to recent unsubstantiated allegations causing distress within the community and in the interest of maintaining a harmonious and pest-free environment, the keeping of any animal other than common domesticated dogs and cats was henceforth prohibited in Serene Meadows. A clause specifically mentioned that so-called therapy animals, not prescribed by a licensed medical doctor and registered with the HOA prior to this date, were included in this prohibition. Existing non-compliant animals were to be removed within 7 days, or daily fines of $500 would be levied. It was a direct retaliatory strike clearly aimed at ensuring that even if Clover had miraculously survived, he could never return, and that no other child like Lily could ever find solace in such a companion within Serene Meadows. The psychological warfare intensified. Millicent began a subtle but insidious campaign to discredit Evie and, horrifyingly, Lily. She'd make comments to other neighbors just loud enough to be overheard about that poor troubled Hayes child and her overwrought, litigious mother. She'd sigh theatrically about the stress of dealing with unstable individuals who make up stories to get attention. Some neighbors, those already inclined to admire Millicent's iron grip on the community, or those fearful of her displeasure, began to look at Evie with suspicion, their greetings cooler, their interactions strained. Lily's world, already shattered by the loss of Clover, began to shrink further. The whispers, the changed atmosphere, her mother's visible stress. She absorbed it all. Her nightmares intensified. She refused to play in the backyard, the sight of Clover's empty hutch, a constant, silent accusation. Her sessions with her therapist, Dr. Ramirez, became exercises in managing profound grief and a newly instilled fear of her own neighborhood. Dr. Ramirez, a kind, insightful woman, was appalled by what had happened and offered to provide any necessary statements or testimony regarding the crucial role Clover played in Lily's emotional regulation and the devastating impact of his loss. Then came the direct, ongoing threat. Brutus Millicent Thornwood's massive mastiff began to appear accidentally in their yard with increasing frequency. A gate left unlatched by the gardener, a momentary lapse by the dog walker Millicent had to hire because of her own distress over these baseless accusations. Each time, the dog, an intimidating mountain of muscle and teeth, would snuffle around Clover's hutch, its presence a terrifying reminder for Lily and a calculated act of intimidation towards Evie and Ben. Millicent's apologies were always profuse, always insincere. "Oh dear Brutus, you naughty boy, he's just so spirited. I am so terribly sorry, Dr. Hayes. It won't happen again." But it always did. Ben, usually so mild-mannered, was incandescent. "She's taunting us." "Evie, she's deliberately letting that beast terrorize Lily. We need a restraining order. We need to fortify this damn yard like Fort Knox." He spent a weekend reinforcing their fence, adding extra latches, his jaw tight with a fury that matched Evie's own. The local police, while sympathetic to the repeated incursions by Brutus, were limited in their response. Animal Control issued more warnings to Millicent, but without Brutus actually attacking anyone, their powers were constrained. Detective Sharp, a seasoned investigator who had taken over the primary criminal case from the overwhelmed Officer Crumans, was building a solid case for animal cruelty and theft based on the video and Evie's testimony. But he admitted the charge of psychological abuse of a minor was harder to make stick without extensive and often conflicting expert testimony, and that Millicent's high-priced lawyer was already filing motions to have the video evidence suppressed, claiming illegal recording and invasion of privacy. "Her lawyer is good," Dr. Hayes, Sharp, had said, his expression grim. "He's going to try to paint you as a vindictive, obsessed neighbor and Mrs. Thornwood as the victim of a personal vendetta. He'll argue that while the rabbit's death was unfortunate, it was at worst a moment of poor judgment by a stressed community leader, not a calculated act of felony cruelty. And he'll try to shred the therapy animal documentation claim. It's just a pet, you're over-sentimentalizing." Evie knew he was right. This was a game she understood, a game played in courtrooms and depositions, a game of legal chess. Millicent Thornwood had money influence and a ruthless lawyer, but Evie Hayes had something more powerful, the truth, an unshakable resolve, and a depth of professional expertise that Millicent was about to discover. The turning point. The moment Evie decided to escalate beyond the local legal channels came during a particularly harrowing therapy session with Lily. Dr. Ramirez had been trying a new approach, encouraging Lily to draw her feelings. Lily, who usually found art a calming outlet, had produced a series of dark, terrifying sketches: a giant, monstrous dog with red eyes, a small, cowering rabbit, and a stick figure of a girl herself weeping in a corner. Then she had taken a black crayon and violently scribbled over the entire page, her small body shaking with a silent, terrible anguish. "The trauma is profound," Evie Dr. Ramirez had said later, her voice heavy with concern. "This isn't just grief over a lost pet. This was a violent, targeted act that has shattered her sense of safety, her trust in the world around her. The ongoing presence of that dog, Mrs. Thornwood's continued campaign against you, it's re-traumatizing her daily. We need to do something more, something to make it stop, to make her feel safe again." That night, Evie made a decision. She had tried to keep her professional identity separate to allow the local system to work. But Lily's suffering, the brazenness of Millicent's attacks, the systemic inertia, it was too much. She arranged a meeting with Detective Sharp and the assistant district attorney assigned to the case, a young, ambitious lawyer named Marcus Finch. Finch, while professionally outraged by the video, was clearly worried about the complexities of the case, the potential for a messy trial, and the political influence of Millicent Thornwood and her connections. He was hesitant about pursuing the psychological abuse charge, fearing it would be too difficult to prove to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. "The animal cruelty, Dr. Hayes. We have a strong case there, especially with the video," Finch had said, tapping his pen. "The theft, yes. But the psychological injury to your daughter, that's a tougher sell. Defense will bring in their own experts to say she's just an upset child, that there's no lasting damage. It could muddy the waters for the other charges." Evie listened, her expression calm, but inside a cold fury burned. This was it. This was the moment. "Mr. Finch, Detective Sharp." She began, her voice quiet but resonant with an authority that made both men sit up a little straighter. What Mrs. Thornwood did to Clover was not just an impulsive act. It was the calculated, malicious destruction of a registered working therapy animal. an animal that was under federal definitions, and by virtue of his documented role in my daughter's treatment plan, an extension of her medical and psychological support system. His destruction in the manner it was carried out and witnessed by me on lawfully obtained security footage from my own property was not just an attack on an animal. It was a direct and intentional act of psychological terrorism against a vulnerable, neurodivergent child. She paused, letting her words sink in. You may also find it relevant to know that I am Dr. Evelyn Hayes. I am the director of the National Animal Rights Protection Task Force. My organization, which often works in conjunction with the Department of Justice and other federal agencies, specializes in complex cases of animal cruelty, particularly those involving extreme malice, organized animal abuse, and the undeniable nexus between animal cruelty and other forms of interpersonal violence and psychological abuse. We have access to the nation's leading forensic veterinarians, child psychologists, specializing in trauma and legal experts in this specific intersection of law. The silence in the room was profound. Finch's pen clattered to his desk. Detective Sharp stared at Evie, a look of dawning comprehension and no small amount of shock on his face. We can provide your office. Mr. Finch. Evie continued, her voice now imbued with the full weight of her professional authority, with expert testimony that will leave no doubt in any juror's mind about the profound and lasting psychological damage inflicted upon my daughter. We can offer comparative case law from across the country, demonstrating how such acts have been successfully prosecuted under enhanced cruelty statutes and even in some jurisdictions as contributing to the injury of a minor. Mrs. Thornwood's actions were not just a local ordinance violation, gentlemen. They were an offense against basic human decency, a violation of multiple state and potentially federal laws if any aspect of Clover's acquisition or her therapy animal status involved interstate elements and an act of profound cruelty that demands the most serious prosecutorial response. My task force is prepared to offer any and all resources at our disposal to ensure that response is robust and unyielding. ADA. Finch, for the first time, looked not just concerned, but deeply, profoundly serious. Detective Sharp leaned forward, a new light in his eyes. Dr. Hayes, he said slowly, I think Mrs. Thornwood is about to discover she picked a fight with the wrong mother and the wrong federal task force director. The revelation of Evie's professional identity sent an immediate shockwave through the local legal system. Ada Finch, initially hesitant, was now galvanized, realizing he had access to an unprecedented level of expert support. Detective Sharp's investigation gained new vigor, armed with the knowledge that this case had implications reaching far beyond Serene Meadows. Evie's task force, operating with professional discretion but undeniable efficiency, began to provide Finch's office with a wealth of information, detailed psychological assessments of Lily's trauma from Dr. Ramirez and other leading child psychologists, case files from similar prosecutions across the country, expert veterinary opinions on the suffering Clover would have endured, and even a behavioral analysis of Millicent Thornwood's actions based on the footage and witness statements, suggesting a pattern consistent with narcissistic personality traits and a high propensity for calculated cruelty. Millicent Thornwood's high-powered lawyer, a slick downtown attorney named Alistair Finch, no relation to the ADA, a source of some initial wry amusement for Evie, found his usual tactics of bluster and obfuscation suddenly ineffective. When he tried to file motions to suppress the video evidence, ADA Finch, now armed with expert legal briefs from Evie's team on lawful surveillance and evidence admissibility, countered them decisively. When Alistair Finch attempted to discredit Clover's status as a therapy animal, he was met with a mountain of documentation and the prospect of expert testimony from nationally recognized authorities on animal-assisted therapy. Millicent herself, likely informed by her lawyer of this formidable new adversary, seemed to oscillate between panicked attempts at damage control and even more brazen acts of defiance. She tried to orchestrate a neighborhood petition in her support, claiming she was the victim of a vindictive campaign by an emotionally unstable individual. The petition garnered a pitiful number of signatures, mostly from her closest cronies on the HOA board. Most residents of Serene Meadows, particularly after Mr. Henderson and the Parker family, a young couple with small children who had been horrified by Millicent's actions, began to speak out about their own past. Negative experiences with Millicent's bullying were now viewing their HOA president with a mixture of fear and dawning disgust. The Parker family, in fact, provided a crucial piece of corroborating evidence. They had a security camera angled towards their own backyard, which inadvertently captured a partial view of Millicent Thornwood's property on the day of Clover's disappearance. Their footage showed Millicent shortly after she had taken Clover frantically hosing down a specific area of her dog, run scrubbing at the concrete with a stiff brush and what looked like a strong cleaning solution. While it didn't show Clover or the dog, it strongly suggested a desperate attempt to destroy evidence, an action entirely inconsistent with her claims of an unfortunate accident. The threat of Brutus, however, remained. Millicent, perhaps as a last act of defiance or a desperate attempt to intimidate Evie into dropping the charges, seemed to allow the dog to roam with even greater frequency. One afternoon, while Lily was in the front yard with Ben tentatively drawing with sidewalk chalk, her first foray into outdoor play since Clover's death, Brutus appeared at the end of their driveway barking aggressively, his massive frame blocking their path. Lily had screamed a raw, terrified sound and scrambled behind Ben, who managed to chase the dog off. That was the final straw for Evie. She had been focusing on the criminal case, but the ongoing psychological torment of her daughter, the constant threat posed by Brutus, demanded immediate action. Using her own expertise and connections, she guided Ben in filing for an emergency civil restraining order against Millicent Thornwood, specifically compelling her to keep Brutus securely confined at all times and to cease all contact, direct or indirect, with the Hayes family. A judge, presented with the security footage of the Clover incident and evidence of Brutus's repeated incursions, granted the temporary order, immediately scheduling a full hearing. The news of the restraining order and the increasingly serious criminal charges began to isolate Millicent further. Her staunchest allies on the HOA board started to distance themselves, fearing legal repercussions. The Serene Meadows Homeowners Association itself was facing potential civil liability for failing to control its president and for its retaliatory bylaw changes. Lily, meanwhile, began the slow, painful process of trying to heal. The terror of Brutus's appearances had been a significant setback, but the granting of the restraining order, a concrete sign that the adults in her life were taking action to protect her, seemed to offer a small measure of security. She still refused to talk about getting another therapy animal. The wound of Clover's loss was too raw, too deep. But she started to draw again, her pictures still tinged with sadness, but with tiny glimmers of her old creativity re-emerging. She drew Clover with angel wings, flying over a rainbow. She drew herself small and brave, protected by a fierce, loving mother figure, who bore a striking resemblance to Evie, but with a superhero cape. The community, too, was in turmoil. Some residents, like Mr. Henderson and the Parkers, organized a quiet candlelight vigil in the neighborhood park, not just for Clover, but for all victims of cruelty, a small act of solidarity that nonetheless infuriated Millicent. Others, long cowed by Millicent's rule, began to share their own stories of her petty tyrannies, her abuses of power, her vindictive actions. It was as if a dam had broken. The climax of this stage of the ordeal arrived not in an HOA meeting, but in a preliminary court hearing for the criminal charges against Millicent Thornwood. The courtroom was packed. On one side, Millicent, looking pale and drawn, but still radiating an air of affronted dignity, flanked by her expensive lawyer, Alistair Finch. On the other, Evie and Ben with ADA Marcus Finch. No slap suit irony this time, just the dedicated prosecutor and Detective Sharp. Lily was not present on the advice of Dr. Ramirez to spare her further trauma, but her presence was palpable in the weight of the evidence to be presented. Alistair Finch immediately launched into a series of aggressive pretrial motions to dismiss the charges for lack of definitive proof of the cause of the rabbit's death, to exclude the security camera footage as inadmissible, to challenge Clover's official status as a therapy animal. He argued that this was at best a case of a lost pet and an unfortunate accident blown out of proportion by a grieving and vindictive neighbor. But A.D. Finch, meticulously prepared with the support of Evie's task force, countered every motion with calm precision. He presented the harrowing security footage, now enhanced by forensic video analysts from Evie's team, which, while still not showing the final fatal act due to the rosebush, left no doubt as to Millicent's deliberate luring and theft of Clover and her delivery of him to Brutus's enclosure. He submitted Clover's official therapy animal registration veterinary records and a powerful detailed affidavit from Dr. Ramirez outlining Clover's crucial role in Lily's life and the catastrophic psychological impact of his violent death. He presented the Parkers' footage of Millicent cleaning the dog run. He even had sworn statements from former Serene Meadows groundskeepers who testified to Millicent's prior complaints about vermin and her specific instructions to them to remove any animal traps or deterrents near Brutus's run, as her dog enjoyed the occasional hunt. The most dramatic moment came when Ada Finch called a surprise witness, a former veterinary technician who had once worked for Millicent Thornwood's personal veterinarian. The technician, her voice trembling but clear, testified that Mrs. Thornwood had on at least 2 prior occasions brought in small animals, a neighbor's cat, a squirrel, that Brutus had caught and had shown a disturbing lack of concern, even a strange sort of pride in her dog's aggressive tendencies. She had even, the technician testified, once joked about Brutus needing more exciting prey than squirrels. While not directly related to Clover, it painted a chilling picture of Millicent's callous disregard for animal life and her tacit encouragement of her dog's aggression. Alistair Finch's attempts to discredit the technician were clumsy and ineffective. Her testimony was clearly deeply damaging to Millicent's carefully constructed facade of the gentle, animal-loving community leader. The judge, a stern, experienced jurist named Hannah Rosenthal, listened to all of this with growing disapproval. After hours of legal argument, she delivered her rulings. Motion to dismiss the charges denied. Motion to exclude the video evidence denied. Motion to challenge Clover's therapy animal status denied. She found probable cause to bind Millicent Thornwood over for trial on all charges felony animal cruelty, with aggravating circumstances due to the therapy animal status and extreme malice. Grand theft. Clover, as a registered therapy animal, had significant monetary and intrinsic value and significantly contributing to the psychological injury of a minor. Millicent Thornwood visibly sagged, her composure finally cracking. The prospect of a public trial, of having all this sordid evidence laid bare, of facing actual prison time, was clearly terrifying. Alistair Finch, for the first time, looked genuinely worried. As they left the courtroom, Evie felt not triumph, but a profound weary sense of a battle hard fought and far from over. But justice, however slow, however arduous, was finally inexorably moving forward. The judge's ruling at the preliminary hearing sent a clear signal. Millicent Thornwood was facing a strong prosecution and the very real possibility of a conviction and incarceration. Her carefully constructed world of suburban privilege and untouchability began to crumble. The HOA board, facing a potential lawsuit from residents for negligence and mismanagement under Millicent's tenure, finally found its courage and voted to suspend her as president, pending the outcome of her trial, appointing a temporary leadership committee headed by a reluctant but principled Mr. Henderson. Millicent's social standing in Serene Meadows evaporated. Former allies now crossed the street to avoid her. Her lawn, once a symbol of her meticulous control, began to look slightly unkempt, as if mirroring her own internal disarray. Brutus, under the terms of the strengthened restraining order now made permanent pending trial, was either confined to the house or taken out only on a heavy leash and muzzle by a professional dog walker, his menacing presence in the neighborhood drastically curtailed. The wheels of justice, however, grind slowly. Months were consumed by pretrial motions, discovery, and depositions. Alistair Finch, Millicent's lawyer, fought every step, employing every delaying tactic in his expensive arsenal. But ADA Marcus Finch, now fully supported by the expert resources of Evie's National Animal Rights Protection Task Force, met him blow for blow, his case growing stronger with each passing week. Forensic accountants from Evie's team, reviewing the HOA financials obtained under subpoena, even uncovered evidence of Millicent potentially misusing HOA funds for her own personal legal fees in unrelated prior disputes, adding another layer to her potential legal woes, though this was kept separate from the animal cruelty case to maintain focus. For Lily, the passage of time brought a slow, fragile healing. With Brutus no longer a constant threat, and with her mother's fierce, unwavering advocacy for justice providing a sense of safety and validation, some of her anxieties began to recede. Dr. Ramirez worked patiently with her, helping her process the trauma and grief. She still couldn't bear the thought of another therapy animal. Clover's place in her heart was irreplaceable. But she started drawing again, her pictures gradually losing their dark, terrifying edge. She drew Clover surrounded by stars, a gentle guardian angel. She drew fantastical creatures, brave and kind, who protected the innocent. Evie, meanwhile, threw herself into her work with the task force with a renewed sense of urgency, the personal horror of Clover's death, fueling her professional determination to combat animal cruelty on a larger scale. She knew that for every Millicent Thornwood who faced justice, there were countless others whose cruelty went unpunished. But her own ordeal had also shown her the power of a single determined voice, the importance of meticulous investigation, and the profound impact that holding abusers accountable could have not just for the immediate victims, but for the wider community. The trial of Millicent Thornwood, when it finally commenced nearly a year after Clover's death, was a local media sensation. The courtroom was packed daily. Millicent, looking drawn and older, attempted to maintain an air of wronged dignity, but the weight of the evidence against her was crushing. The security camera footage played for the jury was devastating in its depiction of her cold, calculated actions. The Parkers' footage of her scrubbing the dog run added a clear inference of consciousness of guilt. The testimony of the former veterinary technician painted a chilling picture of her callous disregard for animal life. Dr. Ramirez's testimony about the profound, lasting psychological trauma inflicted on Lily was heart-wrenching and powerful. Even Officer Crewmans in his initial report had noted Millicent's bizarre lack of empathy and her immediate attempts to deflect blame. Evie herself took the stand a composed, credible witness. She recounted the events of that terrible afternoon, her voice steady, but filled with an undercurrent of a mother's enduring pain. She explained Clover's vital role in Lily's life, his official status as a therapy animal, and the unique, irreplaceable bond they had shared. Alistair Finch's attempts to portray her as a hysterical, vindictive neighbor fell flat against her quiet dignity and the sheer weight of factual evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. The verdict, when it came, was unequivocal guilty on all counts: felony animal cruelty with aggravating circumstances, grand theft, and in a significant victory for A.D. Finch, and a testament to the strength of Dr. Ramirez's testimony and the supporting evidence from Evie's task force, guilty of contributing to the psychological injury of a minor. Millicent Thornwood remained impassive as the verdict was read, but a slight tremor in her perfectly manicured hands betrayed her shock. Her world had finally irrevocably collapsed. At the sentencing hearing a few weeks later, Judge Rosenthal delivered a stern lecture on the societal importance of protecting vulnerable children and animals and the egregious abuse of power Millicent Thornwood had demonstrated. She sentenced Millicent to 3 years in state prison, the maximum allowable under the combined charges, followed by 5 years of intensive probation. She was also ordered to pay substantial restitution to the Hayes family for Clover's value, Lily's ongoing therapy costs, and emotional distress. Furthermore, she was permanently banned from owning any animals, from serving in any capacity on any HOA board or similar organization, and was required to undergo intensive psychological counseling and anger management therapy. As Millicent Thornwood was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, no longer the imperious HOA president, but a convicted felon, Evie felt not a sense of triumph, but a profound, weary relief. Justice in this instance had been served, but the scars for Lily, for their family, would remain. In the year that followed, Serene Meadows underwent a quiet revolution. The HOA, under new, more compassionate leadership, began to dismantle Millicent's legacy of petty tyranny. Discriminatory bylaws were repealed. New policies promoting inclusivity, responsible pet ownership, and respect for neurodiversity were implemented. A small memorial garden, funded by community donations, was planted in the neighborhood park with a simple plaque dedicated to Clover, a beloved friend and healer, and to all creatures who bring comfort and joy. Lily continued her journey of healing. She would never forget Clover, but the knowledge that the person who had hurt him and her had been held accountable allowed her to slowly, tentatively begin to trust again. She started volunteering at a local animal shelter with Ben on weekends, her gentle touch and quiet empathy a comfort to the abandoned and rescued animals there. She wasn't ready for another therapy animal of her own, not yet, but she was finding new ways to connect, to heal, to grow. One cool autumn afternoon, Evie found Lily sitting in their backyard, near the spot where Clover's hutch had once stood. She wasn't crying, she was drawing. In her sketchbook was a vibrant, detailed picture of a beautiful garden, filled with rabbits of all shapes and sizes playing freely under a benevolent sun. In the center of the garden was a majestic Flemish giant, gray and serene, with a tiny, almost invisible halo above his head. And beside him, holding out a carrot, was a small girl with bright, curious eyes, her face tilted upwards, a tentative smile gracing her lips. Evie sat beside her, her arm around Lily's shoulders. "That's a beautiful garden, sweetie," she said softly. Lily leaned against her. "It's Clover's garden," she whispered. "It's where he's happy now, and he's not alone. And neither am I." Evie held her daughter close, her heart aching with a love so fierce it was almost painful, but also with a profound sense of hope. The darkness they had endured had been terrible, the cruelty almost unimaginable. But through it all, they had found strength in each other in the pursuit of justice and in the quiet, enduring power of compassion. The fight had been worth it. For Clover, for Lily, for every vulnerable soul, human or animal, deserving of a world a little kinder, a little safer, a little more serene.